Begin the current Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf 11 lines down at the top of the Amid, where we continue with the theme of the previous Mishnah, is discussing the laws of refuah on Shabbos regarding the prohibition, the rabbinic prohibition, but doing medicine and therapies on Shabbos. Ashir is co-sponsored because of Cheskel, Torah Anytime, Daf Yomi. Appreciate everyone who's joining us today. Some ideas we're going to speak about in today's Daf is using vinegar as a medication for a toothache. Additionally, whether a regular person may use rose oil, or is that only for someone of, let's say, nobility, of wealth. Then we begin the 15th parak, which discusses kinds of knots. It's called Elu Kasharm, and whether they may be tied depending what type of knot it is. Additionally, the terms and concepts of Kol Yisrael B'nei Melachim are those who hold that all Jews are considered to be princes, and if a prince is allowed to do something because it's not obvious that it's for a fool, because he's wealthy, all Jews may have that status. Literally, the concept of hayil. Hayil, the actual word hayil means sins. But in halacha, in the context of our Gemara, hayil means that once somebody's permitted, like for example on Shabbos Kodesh, a gzei wouldn't be made against doing it on Yom Kippur. So although that actual heter wouldn't be applicable, as we'll see in the Gemara on Yom Kippur, but if Shabbos, which is more severe, more stringent, we're allowed to do it, then Yom Kippurim, we're allowed to do that too. Additionally, the term that comes up many times in this Masechta is psikreisha b'lo yamas. Even Rabbi Shloimy holds that if a certain malacha is, that even though he'll be davashet meskabin is mutter, something that's unintended is permitted, but if it's certain to result, what's called inevitable, then he would agree that it's going to be asur. Also, we'll see the halacha from Rabbi Meir. He holds that kol kesher sheyachal atiroi, the achas miyad, of any knot that a person could undo with one hand, and chayam alav, he holds that then a person not going to be liable for making or undoing such a knot. So we begin the current daf, Kufiyat Aleph, 11 lines down, where we begin the Mishnah, a continuation of the theme of refuah on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah, if someone has a toothache on Shabbos, so you cannot sip with them the vinegar. Meaning, if you're sipping the vinegar, it's pretty obvious that you're doing it because you want to heal the teeth, and that's refuah. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Aval buwat, mitabel hu kedarker. What he could do is, he could dip his bread, his food, as normally, into vinegar, and eat it. In the strap. If he gets healed, he gets healed. To go ahead and start sipping it, it's pretty obvious you're taking it as a medication. But you could eat, and then if you get healed, you get healed. So too, similarly says the Mishnah, someone has, by his loins, by his thighs, he's in pain. He went on a big jog, he took a marathon, Erev Shabbos, he's in pain. Says the Mishnah, he's not going to go ahead and smear himself with wine and vinegar, because generally when a person smears himself with that, it's only for medicinal purposes. So therefore that would be forbidden again, because that would be obvious that you're doing it for refuah. But what you could do is you could smear yourself with oil, because oil, as long as it's thin oil, you're not doing anything, and people do it just because of their skin. They're not doing it for necessarily healing purposes. Now, v'lo shemen vered, and however, you cannot use rose oil. Now, why can't you use rose oil? Because it's very expensive, and it's not so common. If you're using rose oil, it's pretty obvious that you're doing it because you're doing it for refuah purposes. A very expensive thing, you don't do it just for just regular oil. You're using a special type of oil for refuah, so that's going to be obvious that you're doing it for refuah purposes. Now, that says the Mishnah, but B'nei Melachim, Tanakama says, but princes, Sachan Shemin Verial Makesem, they could go ahead and smear this rose oil on their wound, because that's the way they do it during the week, even without a wound. So it's not obvious he's doing it for refuah purposes, because by us and in the palace we always have this rose oil even during the weekday. Now Shimon, he says Kol B'nei Yisrael, Kol Yisrael B'nei Malachim. It says all Jews are considered princes. We're all nobility, and therefore every Jew is allowed to use the rose oil. It's not obvious, not evident that he's doing it for refuah. Just like a prince is just like it's a regular thing that they do. Here also it's not obvious that it's for refuah. Now the Gemara has the following question. Ramile, he posed a contradiction, that is Ravacha Aricha, who's called Ravacha the Long One, to what was his real name, was Ravacha Bar Papa. He asked Rabbi the following question. He says, now we learn in our Mishnah, if someone has a toothache, you're not allowed to sip vinegar, because that's obvious you're doing this for healing purposes for your teeth. Now remember that to say, it sounds like obviously from the law of the Mishnah that vinegar is good for the teeth. If you have a toothache, take some vinegar, it'll help the teeth. Problem is, but there's a pasuk in Mishnah that says, like vinegar to the teeth, and like smoke to the eyes, the pasuk there ends. So too is the lazy one for the one who sends him. Meaning it's brach. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you're gonna shake this guy, you're gonna get back nothing. So that's how vinegar is to the teeth. So that sounds like vinegar is bad for the teeth. So how are you saying in the Mishnah, you're not allowed to use vinegar on Shabbos for the teeth because that's going to heal, it's going to take care of the pain? Sounds like it's a good thing. Is it good or is it bad? So the Gemara has two different answers. So the Gemara loikash, it's not a difficulty. The pasuk is talking about, there's two types of vinegar. The pasuk is talking about b'kiyud the peri, the unripe juice of the fruit which didn't fully ripen. That's like acrid. That is harmful for the teeth. And that's what the pasuk is saying, kechamis l'shinayim. The Mishnah is talking about b'chala, regular vinegar. Regular vinegar, that processed vinegar, is actually good for the teeth. That's one approach. If you want, you could say, hava b'chala. Actually, both the pasuk and the Mishnah are talking about regular vinegar. The Mishnah is talking about the ikamaka, that you have a wound, you have pain in the teeth. The pasuk is talking about the lekamaka, that there's no wound. What does that mean? So the Gemara explains. Ikamaka, if you have a wound, if you have pain in your teeth, masi, so it heals it. Lekamaka, if you don't have any wound, mirapi is going to loosen the teeth because it shrinks. The vinegar contracts on the gums. So if you have a wound, so you've blown up, so it's going to go ahead and make it less, and then you're going to be back to regular. But if you have regular teeth, then it's going to shrink the gums even more. It's going to loosen the teeth and going to make them distant one from the other. That's going to be bad for the teeth. So that's the Gemara has, again, either that the pasuk is talking about the juice of the unripe fruit, or it's because it's talking about healthy teeth, which is then bad for the teeth to take vinegar. But again, in our Mishnah is talking about when it's going to be good for the teeth, and therefore that's a problem about sipping the vinegar because of refuah on Shabbos. So we said in the Mishnah, as we quoted before, Mishnah says, if you have a toothache, you're not allowed to sip with them the vinegar, because sipping the vinegar is evident that you're doing it for refuah purposes. That has the Gemara, but the time when the Brisa says lo yigameu pilot, the Brisa says that look, you can't sip and then spit out because that's obvious doing for a food. You're not even eating it. You're not even spitting it out. Now, but the inference of the Brisa is migameu pilot, that you could go ahead and sip and spit out and swallow it. So that contradicts the halacha of the Mishnah. The Mishnah seems to indicate that you can't sip it at all, which sounds like even if you're going to swallow it. Now, the Brisa, however, sounds like not only do you spit it out, obviously, what are you doing it for? For the teeth. But if you swallow it, then it's going to be okay. So how to resolve that contradiction? So the Gemara here gives two answers. Baya says, you're right, Kitzna nam masnin, when we learn in the Mishnah, that it's going to be forbidden to sip the vinegar. It's mega pilots now. It's talking about if you're sipping and you're spitting out. But you're right, you could sip slow. Vinegar was used in different types of foods and dishes or whatever. If you're sipping and so it's hitting the teeth when you're sipping. That's what you do when you sip. Your teeth are being hit. You're going slowly and it's hitting the teeth. So you could do that as long as you swallow. It's not problematic. It's not evident. But if you're sipping and you're spitting out, it's tista, right? Obviously that you're doing it for food purposes. That's what would be forbidden. So the Mishnah is exactly like the Brisa according to Abai. Rav Amma, he says, no. You could say the halacha by Mishnah that says you're not allowed to sip the vinegar is even if you're going to swallow it. So how do we resolve the contradiction with the Brisa that says clearly from the inference that it would be permitted? So Khan is because the Brisa says you're allowed to go ahead and sip and swallow is lefnei tibul. It's before the dipping of the food, meaning before you're eating the meal, then it's permitted to sip and swallow. Because, as Rashi explains, their norm was to dip their food into vinegar. It was one of the dips that they used. So whoever sees you sipping the vinegar, so he thinks that that's your dipping. Meaning, some people, they take the salt first and they take this and this. So the guy's putting in the vinegar and then he's going to add in some of the other foods. And therefore it's not obvious if you're swallowing it. Khan in the Mishnah is talking about la'achar tibul. After you already dipped the food, after you already ate, it's forbidden. Everybody knows you're already full and you already did all your dipping for the meal, so why are you doing sipping the vinegar? Obviously you're doing it for food purposes. So yeah, it's not a contradiction regarding the halacha of megameo boileya, regarding sipping and swallowing. The Brisa that says it's mutter is talking about before you ate the meal. So you're taking in the vinegar, you're having the ketchup, whatever it is, and then you're eating the French fries. It's like you're still not eating, but afterwards, what are you taking this for? You already finished your eating. Obviously, that's for a food purpose. However, the Gemara asks on this, on Rav, how could Rav say this, that before you dip the food? That's the halacha of the brayso that says you're allowed to sip and swallow the vinegar. But after you finished already eating, that's where the Mishnah is talking about you cannot sip and swallow, because that's obvious doing for refuah. But you should say, from the fact that you're saying before you dip the food, you're saying you're allowed to sip and swallow the vinegar, then even after the dipping, you should also be permitted, because the premise of what the Gemara is asking is that you can't have something partly forbidden on Shabbos, which you're saying is after you dip the food, and partly permitted on Shabbos, which is before you did the dipping. Why not? Because the Shamin Leila Rava, we hear that Rava himself, this is Rava who gave this answer. Rava himself says in Masechtas Beya regarding a different type of tefillah. Not the tefillah of food, but the tefillah of in a mikvah. The Islay Hayol, he holds the principle of since. What's this halacha? Because the Amar Rava says, the Hayol that is talking about over there, the Mishnah they discusses in Masechtas Beya, that you can't toivel kelim on Shabbos. Sometimes you have to immerse a keli in the mikvah on Shabbos. In the mikvah. You cannot immerse a vessel on Shabbos, but a person could go in the mikvah on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, so why can't you dip kalim in the mikvah on Shabbos? So Rabbi says because that looks like you're fixing the kli. When suddenly it goes into the mikvah, suddenly you could use it. It's like a masakin, therefore it's forbidden. But a person, when he goes into the mikvah, doesn't look like you're fixing anything. It looks like he's just cooling off. So that the Gemara asks over the Masechtas Beis says, wait a second, that's very good for Shabbos, which you're allowed to bathe. So therefore, it looks like you're just cooling off. But Yom Kippurim, you're not allowed to bathe. That's one of the Chabishinu. You're not allowed to do rechitza on Yom Kippurim. So everybody knows if you're going to the mikvah on Yom Kippurim that you're fixing yourself, because if it's for rechitza, you wouldn't be allowed to. So what are you going to say? You should make a gzeira that you're not allowed to be masakin the adam, because you might come to be masakin to some other things. That's what Rabbi says. He says, no, lekamidi, there's nothing that's from the prohibitions of Shabbos. The B'Shabbos Sharif on Shabbos, which is more severe than Yom Kippurim, it has more stringency, that's going to be permitted, will be Yom Kippurim Asr, and Yom Kippurim is going to be Asr, it can't be. So rather Hoyel, and this is where the principle of Hoyel comes in. Hoyel, since the B'Shabbos Sharif, since the Shabbos is allowed to go into mikvah on Shabbos, because near Kamekah looks like you're cooling off, so Yom Kippurim, not Mishari. Yom Kippurim, even though there you don't have that svara, that logic of it looks like it's cooling off. Well, Yom Kippurim, you can't be cooling off. Yom Kippurim, you're not allowed to go into a body of water. For halacha, you're allowed to go into the body of water, which, as Taisa points out, we don't rule like this, but that's the way the halacha is going. Like that, Yom Kippurim, you're allowed to. You don't make such a gezerah. So therefore, this is the Gemara's question. You see from Rava that when you say the svar of hayil, since this is permitted, that's permitted. So therefore, the same thing should be on Shabbos. Hayil, since that is before you dip, it's permitted. So after you dip, it should also be permitted. Because even though the svar doesn't apply, but you don't differentiate. And therefore, that's what the Gemara is asking Rabbi. How could you say Lifnei Tibo is going to be mutter and Achat Tibo is going to be also? You say Hayil. Hayil, since before the meal is permitted, so then after the meal, it should also be permitted. And that says the Gemara, you're right, Hadabe Rava Mahach. Rava retracted from this answer that he gives over here in our Gemara. This that he wants to say that before the dipping it's going to be permitted, and after the dipping is going to be asr, he rejects that, and because of the principle of Hoyel. Rather, he explains the halacha of the Mishnah the way Abaya explains it, which is that it's simply because of megamei u'peilik. You're actually sipping and you're spitting it out. But you're right, if you swallowed it, it would be permitted the way the brayso says. And that says the Gemara, yeah, we have a contradiction in between this teaching of Hoyel, which sounds like you don't differentiate on Shabbos, and the answer he gives here in our Gemara that it does make a difference if you're sipping and swallowing before the meal or after the meal. So how do you know you retracted from that one? Maybe he retracted from the other halacha. Maybe he holds actually Yom Kippurim you're not allowed to go and immerse yourself in the mikveh, and you don't say Hayil. And that was the one that he said first and retracted from that one. And you're right, Yom Kippurim you can't go because it's not near a Kamekah. That's the Gemara, no, you cannot entertain to say that. Because we're learning a brayso this halacha. The brayso says, Kol chiyuv b'tfilos, toivlin kedarkon, all the obligatory immersions a person has to do in the mikveh, you could do bein b'tesbav, whether on Tisha B'av, bein Yom Kippurim, although those are 2 days, you're not allowed to go ahead and bathe yourself. But if it's a tfilas mitzvah, then you're allowed to. So you see, obviously, how are you allowed to go on the mikveh Yom Kippurim? You're not allowed to bathe yourself. Obviously, we're saying that since Hoyel on Shabbos, you're allowed to because Ner Kameker, so then Yom Kippurim, you're going to say the same type of pasvar. We don't differentiate because it's the same halachic context. So you see, obviously, he holds of Hoyel. holds of hoil, then you can't say that before the dipping it's going to be mutter, and after the dipping it's going to be asur, because we don't differentiate, and therefore that must be he retracted from the other answer, and that actually there's only one answer for the Gemara's answer, for the Gemara's question, the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa. That is, our Mishnah is talking about when it's asur, because sipping and you're spitting it out, and the Brisa is talking about when you're sipping and you're swallowing, and that's where it's going to be permitted. Turn to halacha of the Mishnah that said if someone has pains by his loins, by his thigh area, so chula, etc., where we said that certain things he cannot smear himself because it's obviously doing for a refuah, certain things he could, like oil. Then we had a machlekes regarding rose oil. The Tanna Kama said that you can't use rose oil, but however, a prince could use rose oil because that's regular for him. He does it during the weekday too. It's not obviously doing for a refuah. He's very he uses this type of stuff like regular, like toilet paper. It doesn't mean anything to him. But a poor guy, a regular guy, is for medicine, he'll spend a few $100s. That's where it's obviously doing the rose oil. You do it for healing purposes. That Rabbi Shimon, he disagreed. He says no. Kol Yisrael b'nei malachim. So all Jewish people are princes, and everyone could use it on Shabbos. Now regarding this machlekes, the Gemara brings Amar Baba Bar Zav the Amar Rav. He says halacha Reb Shimon. Halacha follows like Reb Shimon, that yes, every single person is permitted to use their rose oil. Now, the Gemara, however, asks on this and says, Lememra is just to say, the Rav, regarding the leniencies of Shabbos, Reb Shimon Tzvi that he holds like Reb Shimon. He's ruling. He said, Rav says, Allah is like Reb Shimon, which is saying that although the Tanna Kama says you're not allowed to use rose oil, Shimon says you're allowed to, and Rav paskins him, he rules like him, he holds like Reb Shimon in the leniencies of Shabbos. The problem is, but Rav said the following teaching, which seems to indicate that he doesn't hold like Reb Shimon. He says, He says this stopper of the barrels, which was like a type of a shmata, a garment that they would stick into the faucet, into a barrel made of earthenware, because the hole wasn't even. So you had to stuff in some type of a thing to block the wine from coming out, or the water as Gitintam and pays. So that says Rav. You can't stuff it in, you can't stuff it in on Yom Tov, into the hole. Why? Because of schita. Because even though you're not intending for anything to squeeze out, but when your stivik is sticking it in, into that spigot, into that hole, you're going to have some of that squeezing out from that shmata. Now, obviously, he doesn't hold like Reb Shimon, because Reb Shimon would say on this halacha, it's davar she'ein miskaven, it's unintended. And it's unintended, then it would be permitted. So how can you say that Rav rules like Reb Shimon and not look at the Mishnah regarding Shem and Ver that you're allowed to use it? Because he holds like the leniencies of Reb Shimon. We see he disagrees. We see he holds that, no, davar she'ein miskaven is going to be asur, which is like Reb Shimon's classic dispute, and that is Rabbi Yehuda. Says he won't know, it's not true. But he in halacha we just quoted, I thought Reb Shimon might be. Reb Shimon would agree that it would be asur. Why? It's a davar she'ein miskaven, it's unintended. You're not intending to squeeze out any juice from that stopper. Because the Abaye, Rabbi Damatavai, they both say, Moed Reb Shimon agrees, the psik reish below yamas. You're going to cut off the head, it's not going to die? If it's inevitable, Shimon agrees that that's considered intended purpose. So even though you don't necessarily are doing that intentionally, even if Shimon would hold that it's asur, so if it's not a right, we could still say that Rav holds like Reb Shimon. But the Gemara continues asking and says, but V'amar Chibarashi Omar Rav, again we have the teaching from Rav, he says explicitly, halacha Reb Yehuda. Halacha is like Yehuda, that something that's unintended, davar she'ein miskaven, is asur, not like Reb Shimon. And it's Rav Chanan Bar Ami Amar Shmuel, he says in Shmuel, halacha Reb Shimon, so Reb Machlik is Rav and Shmuel, if you hold like that of Reb Yehuda, or like Reb Shimon, but we see clearly that Rav holds like Reb Yehuda, and so too the Gemara brings that Reb Chia Ba'avin Masnila, he taught this machlekes between Rav and Shmuel, B'loi Gavri, without Amiram saying it in their names, rather they themselves, meaning the first version, it wasn't Rav straight up who said it, it was Rav Chia Bar Ashi named Rav, and it was Rav Chanan Bar Ami named Shmuel. He taught this machlekes without any other Amiram, that it was straight. Rav Amar, Rav said halacha Reb Yehuda, Shmuel Amar, and he says halacha Reb Shimon. But again, one thing is we see that Rav holds like Reb Yehuda, who has the more stringent stance on the halachas of Shabbos. So how could Rav say halachas like Reb Shimon by Shimon Ver to be lenient, but he doesn't hold like Reb Shimon in his leniencies on Shabbos? He holds like Reb Yehuda. He holds like the most stringent interpretations of the halachas of Shabbos. So how could he say that you're allowed to use Shimon Ver on Shabbos? So Elam Rabbi, Rabbi says, Ani va'arisha v'chabura targimna. Says me and the lion of the group, which means say the biggest Talmid Chacham of the Chavraya, we're going to explain why it's not a contradiction, Rav on Rav. Why isn't it a contradiction? And first there's a man who's the other one that's going to explain it with. We say like this. It says halacha is Reb Shimon. Yeah, halacha is like Reb Shimon that says you're allowed to use the rose oil on Shabbos, but v'la mitamei. But not because of Reb Shimon's reasoning. Really, the reasoning of Reb Shimon is not correct, but the halacha is going to be correct. Says the Gemara, what does this mean? My halacha Reb Shimon. What does it mean? The halacha is like him, but v'la mitamei, but not for his reasoning. Says the Gemara, if you're going to say halacha Reb Shimon, the shari halacha is like Reb Shimon that it's permitted. But v'la mitamei, it's not because of his reasoning, because the ilu Reb Shimon itself. Because whereas Reb Shimon he holds that masi, he holds that rose oil it's for healing purposes. And even so, it's going to be permitted because you can't have a situation where it's permitted for this person and forbidden for that person. That's the leniencies of Reb Shimon. We also, for princes, it's permitted. It's going to be permitted for every single person. For Rav held no loy masi. It's not going to heal. That's why you're allowed to use rose oil on Shabbos. So that would be okay. That would be like everyone, like Rabbi Yehuda. Rav wouldn't have to be like Reb Shimon. So you're allowed to use rose oil because it's not a healing thing. It's not a therapeutic thing. Therapeutic, so you could use it. Reb Shimon is because he holds a leniency that no, it is healing. But if you're going to permit for princes, you're going to permit for everyone else. Says the Gemara, if that would be the interpretation, that would be difficult. Because for Sava Rav Limasi, does Rav hold that rose oil is not healing? But V'Melikatani, in fact, we learned in the Mishnah. But name Malachim, which is the Tanakama, who, if anything, Rav is like the Tanakama. But name Malachim Sachan Agabe Makasein Shevin Bered. The Tanakama said princes they could smear, they could anoint on their wounds rose oil. Now Machlal Demasi. Obviously, even the Tanakama, who says that you're not allowed to use it, that's obviously it's healing. Because if it was not healing, then what do you need it for? So everyone holds it's healing. So how can you say that that's machlekes that Rav holds like halachas like Reb Shimon, that everyone could use the rose oil, but not because of Reb Shimon's reasoning that it holds that you don't differentiate in healing. It could be you can't say permitted for one and permitted for another one, but you can't say that every Tana holds that it's healing. Machlekes was, but do we say it only for princes? Do we say it for everyone? So what would it mean Rav holds like Reb Shimon, but not according to his reasoning? Why would it be permitted? It is healing. And the rather says the Gemara as follows: Halacha Reb Shimon deshari. The halacha Reb Shimon that is permitted to use the rose oil on Shabbos for everyone, but that's not based on the reasoning of Reb Shimon, because you're right, it doesn't hold like Reb Shimon, as we said he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, because the ilu Reb Shimon itself, whereas Reb Shimon he holds avagav de lo yishriach. Even though it's not common, the rose oil, in this location, so the one who's smearing with it, and it's very expensive, everybody knows that he's only smearing it for refuah purposes, because it's not something you just waste and use, it's a very precious commodity. Still, even though it's obvious it's for refuah purposes, Shari, Reb Shimon holds going to be permitted because every single Jew is like a prince, whereas Rabbi Yehuda, he says forbidden. Because it's obviously doing it for refuah purposes, and you're not a prince, because and that's why it's obviously doing it for refuah purposes. Rav held like this. He says ish shriach in. He says no. If it's commonly found, so it's all over the place. So then yes, it's not. You could use it because it's not obviously doing it for refuah. Ve'iloi shriach loy. But if it's not commonly found, not like Reb Shimon, says you cannot use it because then obviously it's expensive. It's a yakar mitzias, and if it's obviously doing it for a refuah purpose, you can't normally afford this. You would only do it if you have a wound. Now, so what does it mean he holds like Shmuel, like Reb Shimon? Because the Asa the Rav, in the location where Rav was, Shchiach Mishcha Devarga. It was commonly found, the rose oil. So that's what the Gemara is coming out. Rav really holds like a Yehuda. And therefore you're not allowed to use the rose oil on Shabbos because a regular person can't afford it. If you're using it, obviously doing it for refuah purposes. It's just that, what does it mean he held like Reb Shimon? Because where Rav lived, he says you're allowed to use the rose oil even if you're not a prince. Why? Because everybody had. It's in that location where everybody had it was available everywhere, and therefore it's not obvious doing it for refuah purposes, and that's why it says permitted. But again, but not because he holds like Reb Shimon. No, he holds like Rabbi Yehuda. He holds that B'Shem Eskaven is usher, and he holds that for if it's obvious for refuah, it's going to be usher. And you don't say, because mutter for princes, mutter for everyone. Where Rav lived, he says you're allowed to use the rose oil because everyone is accessible to everybody, and therefore he says it's permitted to use that on Shabbos. Shall we turn to the 14th parak, Masechta Shabbos parak Shemona Shratzim, which spoke about when we started off with the 8 types of shratzim regarding trapping them, the malach of tzeda and chavala of inflicting a wound, and ma'abed and of tanning and of refuah. So on that we continue with the 15th parak ve'elu ksharim, which talks about these are the knots. This is regarding the halach of kosher matter, making a knot, undoing a knot. So our Mishnah is going to be discussing actually this and the next Mishnah, which are both on this daf, regarding 3 types of knots. Level 1 knot is asur midaraisa. That's the biblical knot for making and undoing such a knot on Shabbos. Level 2 is asur drabanan. It's not really the biblical knot, but it's similar enough as going to be rabbinically forbidden. Level 3 is going to be a type of a knot that's going to be mutter l'ketchila, that initially you're allowed to go ahead and make that on Shabbos. So the Mishnah begins. These are the knots that the person is going to be liable for them of karban chatas, which was counted amongst the av malachas in Perikal Gadol, which we said, if someone is kosher, makes a knot, or a matter, or undoes a knot, those are two of the av malachas of the certain av malachas, which that's if you make what's called a kesher shel kayama. You make an everlasting knot, which is never undone, because that's exactly what it was in the Mishkan. When they would make the knots and the threads by the urias, if they got undone, you're making a knot, that would to stay forever. It wasn't to do and undo, it's to stay forever. So therefore the av malacha is if it's what's a kesher shel kiyama. What are cases that your chayiv is considered a kesher shel kiyama? That says the Mishnah kesher hagamal, the knots of the camels, the kesher asapanin, and the knots of the sailors, which the Gemara is going to explain exactly what does that mean. Now says the Mishnah, and just like you're liable for making the knot, so you're liable for undoing the knot. As the Gemara teaches in Klal Gadol Daf Ayin, we learned in Daf Ayin Dalma Beis, like those who would trap the chilazim, which was a certain type of snail fish that had the tchelis die inside of it, where sometimes they had to go ahead and loosen the knots of the net, sometimes they had to make it bigger or smaller, so you'd be tying and untying the knots. That's how we know that there's a liability of kosher and matur. So therefore, if you make if this knot of the camel or of the boat, if you make it or you undo it, you're going to be chayiv for one of those av malachas of kosher and matur. Now, Meir, he says, Kol kesher shu yochel atir ba'achas miyadav. Any knot that you could undo with just one hand, where obviously it's not so tight, in chayam lav, you're not liable, even if you make it to stay permanently. That type of a bow is not going to be chayiv for making or undoing that on Shabbos. Now the Gemara goes to explain the halacha of the Mishnah. My kesher hagamal and the kesher sapanim. What are we talking about when we mean the knot of the camels and the knot of the boats? If you think it means to say that it's the knot that they knot in the nose ring, which is as follows. That see this picture over here. So what they would do is they would make a hole. Actually, this picture first. They would make a hole for the naka. The naka is like a female camel in its nose, and they would put in a quote-unquote a ring of a string of rope, and they would tie it, and that would stay there forever. Now, when they wanted to then, however, tie the animal to, let's say, a post or to some other beam to let's say, keep the animal in a certain place, they would tie another rope onto that ring. So when the Gemara is saying, what's called kitru the country biz mama, that it means to say that this strap that's tied onto the ring, if you think that's what we're talking about in the Mishnah, or similarly, v'kitru the country be'istar terida, which is also in the boat, they made a, so to speak, a type of ring in the hull of the ship, which they would make out of some type of rope or some type of string, and that would be in the hole in the top of the boat, and that would stay there forever. Now, when they wanted to go to port or whatever it is, they would tie a strap onto that ring, and that would keep it there until they wanted to go ahead and leave again. So when the Gemara is saying kitru the katru b'stadrida, we mean to say that long rope that would be attached into that rope, into that ring that was always there over there. If you think that's what we're talking about in the Mishnah that says Kesh HaGamal and Kesh HaSapan refers to this, but how can you say that's where you'd be liable for Karban Chatas? That's a knot that you're making that's not there to last forever, because it's only temporarily now that you're, let's say, staying overnight or here for the week with the boat. But when you're going to leave, it's meant to be undone. And we just explained that we learned that from the Urias that the Kishar, the knots, are only if it's Kesher Shel Kiyamar, an everlasting knot. So the other rather says the Gemara, you're right, Kitra Dizmama Gufe. We're talking about the knot of the nose ring itself, or this Terida Gufa, or from that ring in the boat itself. This is the case of the Chiyav Da'iraisa. Is the one that you make in the nose or in the boat, that's meant to stay there forever. You never undo that knot, and therefore that's where you're going to have the Chiyav Da'iraisa. Now, Rimei he had said, Kol Kasher B'chul, he says, any knot that you could undo with one hand, you're going to be patur. So related to this halacha, So Boyer of Achtaboy, which was Achuy de Maracha, the brother Maracha, he said, so that's where you're making a knot. But he says, Aniva, what's halacha with a bow? Where you make it very tight. L'Reb Meir, according to Reb Meir, what's the halacha? What's the question? Says the Gemara, at time of Reb Meir, the reason that Reb Meir is Mishum Diyochalatir Ba'achim the other one, he says because you could undo it with one hand, that's not considered a bona fide knot. Now, for Hanami Yochalatir, a bow, you could also pull with one hand and undo the bow, so maybe then it would be permitted. Maybe, no, time of Reb Meir, the reason Reb Meir is Mishum Dilimahadi, because if a regular knot that you could undo with one hand, obviously is not so tight. But a bow is interesting, although you could pull it out with one hand, but it could be very tight, as people tie their shoelaces on Shabbos. It's still tight enough. So maybe then it actually would be forbidden to undo that. So if you want to take a little stand, it's not clear what the halacha would be according to Meir in the halacha of making a bow. Now we continue with the next Mishnah, which again, this question of the Gemara was unsure again, because what's the criterion of Meir? Is it the ability to untie with one hand, or is it only loose knots can be untied with one hand? And that's nafkamina, like we're saying, is a bow tied tightly but can be untied with one hand. That's nafkamina according to Reb Meir. But now the Gemara continues with the next Mishnah, which is in the middle of this discussion essentially that we're discussing over here. Says the Mishnah like this: it's continuing on the exemptions of knots. There are certain knots that you're not liable under the karmachatis, like you are liable, as we said in the previous Mishnah, kekesher hagamalim, like the knot you make in the nose of the camel, or kekesher sapanin, and like the knots of the boats. Rather, the halacha is going to be somewhere in the middle. It's going to be pater, you're going to be exempt from the chiyuv of chatas, but it's going to be rabbinically forbidden. And I'm going to explain exactly what is this case. Then the Mishnah continues. It's actually mutar l'katchila. Is kasheres isha, a woman could tie miftah chalukah, the opening of her blouse, which Rashi says the way the galachim used to have it, which they have like a string on either side of their blouse, and they tie the right side on the left shoulder, the left one on the right shoulder, and since every single day she undoes it at nighttime, so it's not comparable at all to even be rabbinically forbidden, to be like somewhat of a kesher shel kiyama, because it has no continuity at all, because you take it part every day, so it's mutlak t'chili even to tie that. So too, the chutei svacha, the strings of her hat, the shalpsikya, or of a girdle, which is this type of wide belt, which have these straps hanging by the top, which you tie it with. Also, the b'ritzuis minol b'sandal, the laces of shoes and of sandals, b'noidis yain b'shemen, and the flasks of wine and oil, which those flasks are made out of leather, and they would generally bend the opening of the flask into the top and tie it like that, or b'kedei shel basar, or a pot of meat, which sometimes that you tie a garment on the opening. All these things are considered so temporary that they're mutar l'katchila, because you're always tying and untying, so it doesn't even have any similarity at all to a kesher gema that would be permitted to tie and untie on Shabbos. Elizabeth Yaakov, he says, you could also tie a rope in front of an animal on the width of the opening of the corral. The shlush takes it, it shouldn't go out. That's also something that's always done and undone. Therefore, it does not have any prohibition at all regarding the laws of Shabbos. Now, the reading of the Mishnah is a little bit terse, so the Gemara asks as a question. It says, Hagufa kasha. The Mishnah itself seems to be difficult, because if you read the words in the Mishnah, you open up by saying, Yesh kishar, and there are knots, Shein chayav nalein, that you're not going to be liable karmachatas, like we said in the previous Mishnah of the knots of the camel and of the ships, so that you're not going to be chayav achatas. Now the inference is chiyuvahu deleka. Okay, these knots that we're describing, there's no karbachatas, there's no issa deraisa, ha'isur ikka. But it sounds like that there is going to be issa drabanan. But hadutani, then you go and you say and sounds like you're saying the cases. A woman could tie the opening of her blouse and so on and so forth. You say all these different cases, which you're saying even initially allowed to. So what is this Mishnah coming to say? Cases that are going to be patav al asr, or that to saying things that even mutar l'katchila. This is what it's saying. Meaning, because if you read the Mishnah, the first two lines don't really explain what the case is, and it sounds like that the next cases are explaining that case. It's not true. There's two different cases in our Mishnah. The Mishnah first opens up by saying, Yesh kisharon she'en chayav nalein, kesher hagamal v'kesher saman. There are certain knots that you're not going to be chayav achatas, like the knots of the camel and knots of the sailors. Now, but it doesn't say what it is. The Gemara is explaining, remind you, what is that case? So that is as you continue top of Kufiyud Beis and Aleph. That's Kitcher the Katri Bizamama. That's the knot that you tie onto the knot of the nose ring. Meaning that long string that they put into that nose ring. And also the Kitcher the Katri Bistarida, the knot that they tie onto the ship's ring. That is where we're going to say that Allah is chiyulahu deleka. There's no chiyuv da'iraisa because it's not meant to stay there forever. But hisur ikad, that's the case where it is going to be like ketchila, rabbinically forbidden to tie it on over there. Why? So Rashi explains because sometimes you leave it there for a week or two, and you tie and you untie this one side that is put onto the beam or the pillar, but you're going to leave this here. Mean to say, a person might decide to say, hey, you know what, we're about to get to the place in a week or a day, or here also with the boat. They might decide to leave this on because they only untied it from the other side, from the dock. But this they can leave, I have to go and tie it again. So since a person might leave it for a week or two or whatever for a long period of time, although it's not meant to be permanent, because you don't usually leave that on the boat, you don't usually leave it on the camel, but at times you might do that, and since it's somewhat permanent, the Rabbanan said that's going to be rabbinically forbidden. That's the middle case that wasn't described in the Mishnah, that is somewhere in the middle, that it's part of a loss. But then that's when the Mishnah continues and says, it doesn't say these words, but that's saying that those certain things are even permitted, even initially. That's the whole list that we said in the Mishnah of Kesheres Mefteche Chalukah. The woman could go ahead and tie the strings of her blouse and etc. And all these different various knots in clothing in common households are considered so temporary that it's not even rabbinically forbidden. It's even going to be mutter lekatchila. Some of this we spoke about today's daf and Shabbos Daf Kufiyud Aleph was that we opened up a Mishnah regarding the laws of refu, which we were speaking about in the previous Mishnahs, of hacheshesh b'shinah. Someone has a toothache, so he said that he cannot sip the vinegar because that's obviously doing it for refuah, but he could do it kedarka. He could dip his bread in the regular way into the vinegar, and if it heals, it heals. So too, he said that if, let's say, he has pains on his thighs, so he said he can't smear with wine and vinegar because if you're doing that, obviously doing for refuah purposes. But you could smear with oil because regular people, they put on oil all the time, and it's not necessarily for refuah purposes. Now there was a machlekes in the Mishnah regarding shemen vered, rose oil. Is that specifically like the Tanna Kama says, only for b'nei malachim, for princes? Or like Reb Shimon, is that Kol Yisrael b'nei malachim, all Jews are considered princes? We don't differentiate between people, and every person would be able to use rose oil. Now the Gemara had a contradiction. We have a pasuk that says, like vinegar to teeth, that's how the lazy person has to one sense. It sounds like vinegar is bad for teeth. How can the Mishnah say you're not allowed to sip vinegar on Shabbos because it's good for the teeth, that's going to take away the pain? So the Gemara had two approaches. Either the pasuk is talking about what's called shiur the peri, the unripe juice of the fruit, which is that acidic, it's vinegary, that's where it's bad for the teeth. But our Mishnah is talking about processed vinegar, which is good for the teeth. Or a second approach was that our Mishnah is talking about where there is a wound. Where there's a wound, you're all blown up, taking vinegar is going to help calm down the tooth area, it's going to shrivel it up a little bit, that's going to be good. The pasuk is talking about where there's no wound. If you take vinegar, it's going to shrink the gums, and then the teeth are going to get loose and distant from each other. That's going to be bad. That's why it's not a contradiction from the pasuk on our Mishnah. And our Mishnah is talking about when it's good, and therefore it's forbidden for refuah on Shabbos. We spoke about the halacha of the Mishnah. It said you shouldn't sip vinegar, and that's all the Mishnah says. So it sounds like you can't sip vinegar no matter what you do with the vinegar, whether you swallow or whether you spit it out. Problem is, we learned in the Brisa that says you can't sip and spit it out. Because then it's like, what are you doing? You're gargling, spitting it out, obviously doing for refuah, but if you swallow, okay, you could sip and you're doing it slowly, sounds like permitted. That seems to contradict our Mishnah. So the Gemara have two answers. Either like Abaye says, which ultimately is the only answer we end up with, is that our Mishnah is talking about that, yeah, you spit it out. You're right, the Mishnah doesn't say it, but talking about you can't sip and spit out. But if you swallow, it's going to be permitted. Rava initially said that, no, it's not a contradiction. The Brisa that says you're allowed to go ahead and swallow it is talking about before you ate the meal. Before you eat the meal, you're about to eat, so it's like taking the ketchup before the French fries. Why are you doing ketchup? Obviously you're doing for refuah, right? No, I'm about to have French fries, I'm putting it in, some of that spice in my mouth. So yeah, vinegar, people would dip their food into vinegar. So you sip a little vinegar, take some food, that's where it's permitted. The Mishnah is talking about, well, you already ate the meal. You already ate the meal. So what are you sipping vinegar? Obviously you have a toothache, so then it's going to be forbidden. But the Gemara rejects that, because Rava himself holds to what's called the principle of hayil. Since it's permitted that, and therefore, if it's permitted for part of Shabbos before you eat the meal, then you can't say it's going to be forbidden for the other part of the meal after, meaning after you finish the meal. Why? Because you see, like Yom Kippur, that you're allowed to go ahead and dip yourself in the mikvah. Why? Why are you allowed to dip yourself in the mikvah? It's near Kimasaka, it looks like you're fixing. Oh no, because since on Shabbos we share similar halachas Yom Kippur, you're allowed to go into the mikvah. Why are you allowed to go into the mikvah? It's near Kimasaka, and like you're now taiva l'kli on Shabbos. No, because it looks like it's cooling off. But Yom Kippur, you don't have the tzvah looking like it's cooling off, because Yom Kippur, you're not go into a body water, you're not even wash your hands. But since on Shabbos you're allowed to, so Yom Kippur you're allowed to, so therefore it must be that he would hold the same thing regarding sipping vinegar. If part of Shabbos you're allowed to sip the vinegar, then we're going to say that all of Shabbos you're allowed to sip the vinegar, because that's the svara of Hoyle. And therefore it must be that, Rav ultimately retracted from this answer, and he doesn't hold like that because he can't say part would be permitted, part would be forbidden, and rather he explains like the way Abaye explains it, that our Mishnah is talking about that you is the same like the Brisa, that when there's a say it's forbidden, there's only begin to spit it out. But if you swallow, then it would be permitted. Then the Gemara brought the Rav, he ruled like Reb Shimon, that it's permitted for everybody, not just for princes, for the Shemin varied for the rose oil. But the problem is, how could Rav rule like Reb Shimon by his leniencies? But he holds in general, like Rabbi Yehuda, that's more stringent than Reb Shimon. He holds Davashin Maskavin as Aser, not like Reb Shimon. So how could he rule that the rose oil is going to be permitted? So that the Gemara answered, he says that, halach is like Reb Shimon, but not because of his reasoning. You're right, it doesn't hold to the reasoning, the rationale of Reb Shimon. Just the halacha comes out like Reb Shimon that you're allowed to use the rose oil. Why? Because Reb Shimon, he holds that even though it's not commonly found, so obviously you're using it for refuah, still he says it's going to be mutter, because he says, like B'nai Malachim, we're not going to differentiate amongst the Jewish people. If princes are allowed to use it, regular people are allowed to use it. No. Rav would hold that would be awesome. So what does it mean he holds that's permitted? Because where Rav lived, it was common to have the Mishchah of Arda. Oh, so it's common, so then it's not evident, because everybody has it. And that's why he said it's mutter, not because of holding Reb Shimon, but simply because he doesn't have the halachic context that Reb Shimon has. Hadran, Allah, Shloime Schwartzberg, you can do this. We finished the 15th berg. I'm talking to myself, by the way, because Langam is left. So we finished, that was the 14th berg, and we started the 15th berg, Perek Ve'el Ksharm, which talks about that on knots. So we had, like we said, 3 different categories that we started off this perek with. We have those that you chayiv on them a korban chatas. And what case is that? That's a kasher hagamalim asapanim, which the Gemara explained. What does that mean? It's kitra dizmamo with ustadrida gufa, meaning it's that which you put into the nose of the camel. You put that into the hull of the ship. That ring stays there forever. That's what's called a kasher shel kayama. And that's what we learn from the Urias. That's the malacha de raisa. That's going to be a chayiv achatas. Now, Meir, he says that if you could undo it with one hand, you're not going to be chayiv. And the Gemara has a taker regarding a bow. On the one hand, a bow, you would say that it's permitted because you could also undo it with one hand. On the other hand, you'd say that no, maybe the reason why he holds that a kesher that you could undo with one hand, obviously means it's not so tight. But a bow is not true. A bow is tight, and therefore maybe he would hold that it's us. So the Gemara doesn't resolve that question. Then with the second mission, we spoke about the second category of the knots, which was a knot that's tied into that knot that's in the nose ring. So that, there's not going to be any chiyuv, but it is going to be rabbinically forbidden because sometimes you will leave that string, that rope that's tied onto the nose ring, you might leave it there for a day or 2 or 3 or whatever, this and that, and on the boat too, so therefore it's somewhat similar to a kesher, so rabbinically that's going to be forbidden. Then there's the third category, which is by the woman's blouse, by her straps, or from the strings of her hat, or of the girdle, or of shoelaces, or of the flask of wine and oil, or that of the pot of meat, and Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg adds on even, let's say, knotting the in front of the animal that it doesn't go out from the opening. Those cases are mutar l'katchila. They're even initially permitted because it doesn't have any kiyum at all. You open and close it all the time, and therefore that's even going to be mutar l'katchila. That's the 3 categories of kesher we spoke about. Thank you for any time hosting us.